It is said the Dutch introduced the magic lantern to Japan through a trading port off of Nagasaki. It became a popular form of village entertainment. Handheld wood lanterns and slides of rice paper told stories of ghosts, goblins, and skeletons, a precursor to what would follow. The foundation of Japan's rich history of cinema built upon ghostly stories, told through rear projection and shadow puppets, to captivate its small village audiences. In 1897, a cameraman presented the Lumiere cinematograph to Japan, and the first footage of the empire was of its sights and short silent films. Unlike Edison's kinetoscope, it had the ability to also project its film, large enough for an entire audience to see. The subjects of the early Japanese films were geishas and kabuki theater. These were short 2 to 3 minute films and were mostly viewed as objects of curiosity. During the early years of the 1900s, Western American films were imported, which allowed for multiple showings and helped establish Japan's first permanent cinema in October of 1903. An X-ray clinic was converted and equipped with projection facilities. By the year 1917, there were 64 cinemas in Japan. 21 of those were in Asakusa, the place of Japan's first cinema had become its film center. The long-held Japanese tradition of oral storytelling bled into the years of early cinema. To accompany the silent films, benchis would introduce the projector, the films, and narrate the events of the film. These performances were raised to a more artistic level when the benchi would begin to not only narrate the events of the films, but also to start inhabiting the characters, giving them distinct voices. Their popularity meant that different cinema houses would compete to hire top benchis to work for them. As the films grew to feature length, it became more and more difficult for one benchi to narrate alone, and soon 2 or 3 benchi were used per showing. The benchi would become the stars, and because of this, and also the technical difficulties of equipping cinemas with sound devices, the silent film era in Japan had a longer life than it did in the West. The Jazz Singer, the first talkie, premiered in New York, and the decline of the silent film happened quite quickly after that. But in Japan, the silent film and the benchi would last well until the 30s. By the 1930s, though, the government had a firm hand in its cinema production. They insisted on propaganda and promotional documentaries, such as films shot directly after the fall of Nanking. By the time Japan was at war with China, the Home Ministry was keeping tight control on the films produced in the empire. Anything that was found to be in criticism of the army or the nation itself were cut or banned. Even overly realistic depictions of war were censored. On December 1941, Japan attacked the United States, and the ensuing war would weaken Japan's economy. Japanese cinema would suffer a great deal during the war years. The films that were released were mostly focused on the ensuing war. Some even depicted the attack on Pearl Harbor. In August of 1945, the United States dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki respectively. Shortly thereafter, the Empire of Japan surrendered and World War II came to a close. In the years that followed, the US would occupy Japan and work towards demilitarization. And to combat the propaganda, hundreds of US films were imported and shown. And during this period, Japanese films were still censored. The idea was to indoctrinate American ideals to the Japanese and suppress all else. A man who would change all of cinema was born in Tokyo in 1910. He spent the early years as an assistant director for a company that would become Toho Studios. His time as an assistant director told him that any good director should be a master of screenwriting. He would go on to co-write all the films he would direct. That man was Akira Kurosawa. Kurosawa joined the film industry after the death of his older brother, who himself was a benchi in Tokyo. Kurosawa's directorial debut was an adaptation and was released in 1943. Sanshiro Sugata faced censorship under the Japanese censorship board for being too Western, and after the film's huge success, Kurosawa was pressured into making a sequel, a piece of pure propaganda. Kurosawa intended for his next film to be more censor board friendly, but by the time of its completion, Japan was under occupation from the United States. The Men Who Tread on Tiger's Tail was based on a kabuki play, and to the American censors was considered too feudal and banned. It wouldn't see a release until the 1950s. Toshiro Mifune began his career by accident, arriving at Toho Studios to apply for a job as a photographer. He would become an actor. After his first feature role, Toshiro met Kurosawa at a talent search held by Toho Studios. Kurosawa later wrote of this chance encounter, saying he was rarely impressed by actors, but with Mifune, he was completely overwhelmed. And so one of cinema's greatest directors found one of its greatest leading men. Their first collaboration was 1948's Drunken Angel. Mifune would play a young Yakuza member diagnosed with tuberculosis. He would radiate charisma on screen. The film was put through 4 censorship rewrites that Kurosawa felt it was the first time he had ever been able to work freely. The The golden age of Japanese cinema began in the 1950s, and its beginnings can be signified with one film, another collaboration between Kurosawa and Mifune. Rashomon was released and found only moderate success in Japan, but later that year it would win the Golden Lion from the Venice Film Festival. Kurosawa would spend the rest of the decade creating many cinematic masterpieces: Seventh Samurai, Throne of Blood, The Hidden Fortress. Mifune would give some of his most iconic performances for Kurosawa during this period. The two would go on to have 16 collaborations, producing pieces of cinema that have withstood the test of time and influenced all who came after it. Japan's fate at the end of the Second World War would be forever entwined with its art, and its cinema reflected the public consciousness. The fear of nuclear attacks would become a central theme to many creative works in Japan. Ishiro Honda would direct the first Godzilla film in 1954. It would spawn a series of spin-offs and sequels. Released the same year as Seven Samurai, both pictures produced by Toho, they would both compete for Best Picture at the Japanese Academy Awards. Seven Samurai would win. During this decade, Yujiro Ozu would release Tokyo Story and Floating Weeds. Masaaki Kobayashi would make The Human Conditions Part 1 and 2, and Kenichi Kawa would release The Burmese Harp. In the preceding decade, Japan's influence would bleed over to Hollywood and the rest of the world. John Sturgis's The Magnificent Seven would release in 1960, a remake of Seven Samurai. Sergio Leone's Fistful of Dollars would release in 1964, 3 years after Kurosawa's Yojimbo. It's hard to reiterate how much the Western genre owes the samurai movie and to Kurosawa himself. Kurosawa's films would also influence another young filmmaker in the 1970s. He would co-opt the samurai robes, the armor, and create counterparts for him set in a galaxy far from our own, and his creation itself would go on to change cinema forever. And aside from the influences it created, Japan would continue to create mesmerizing works of art, the former empire boasting some of cinema's greatest creations. But this is only a brief history.